All right, good. I know. So today we are going to wrap up chapter 29. We're going to specifically focus on China. Now, the condensed version of China in the 20s is this. China's a mess. China is a hot mess. And here's why. Prior to World War I, what's happening to China? Two words. Opium War. And the aftermath. 4 words. And what's the aftermath of the Opium War? Before World War I. All right, not just the British, but all of the different European nations. Yes. All the different European nations that come in and carve out what we call spheres of influence. Now, is China ever completely ruled by a European power?
No.
No. So what this means is that China is being economically controlled and even to an extent violated, but their government is still left to rule the people. Now, if your country is being stripped away of its economic resources, but the government is still in charge, what is that going to do to the people? It's going to make them angry, really angry. And so we saw some examples of rebellions. Like what? The Boxer Rebellion. And the other less famous one? Taipei, nice. All right, so 2 instances where the Chinese people decide that they're tired of the economic exploitation and the inefficiency of their own government, and they try to do something about it. We get to World War I, and all of the different spheres of influence are sucked into the war effort. The British, the French, the Americans, all of their spheres of influence are now being harvested to help with the war effort. They're being exploited even more to come up with even more resources and more cash. Germany's trying to do the same thing with its sphere of influence in China. And then when the war ends, Germany loses its sphere of influence. And this becomes a whole new point of contention, because guess who picks up Germany's sphere of influence? Japan. And so now China continues to be twisted and manipulated by all these different foreign forces. And so inside China, there now becomes this great debate over, what are we going to do? How do we get our country back? So, the Qing dynasty ends just before World War I. The last emperor, and he was kind of offered up as a sacrificial victim. I think he was like a 12-year-old boy or something. Like, he's the one, and no, not like Aztec sacrifice. No, stop it. Stop it. That boy kind of resigns and officially steps down and ends the dynasty. Nick?
Isn't he also the same one who goes and up to Manchuria and is the puppet emperor for Japanese?
Might be. I don't remember. Like I said, this area is not one of my stronger areas in history. But what's left then without a dynasty? This is the first significant stretch of time that China has had in a relatively modern era with no dynasty. I mean, we saw this back in the classical period, and we had the period of warring states, like 200 years, where there was no dynasty after the Han, and that was sad. But the population was small enough, and the surrounding forces weren't powerful enough to really impact China. We're now in the 20th century, and a China without a stable government, I mean, yeah, that's dangerous, not just for the Chinese, but how do you think the West would react to a China without a strong government? That's like open season. Right. That's like the parents saying, all right, kids, we're leaving for a vacation for a month. You be good. Okay. And then the parents posted on Facebook, we're leaving the house for a month. Nobody better come over and do bad things. Like, really? You're going to advertise this? So with the end of the Qing dynasty, I mean, this is basically announcing open season on China. We don't control our country anymore. Please come in. Do what you want. And so what you're going to see, excuse me, is a wide variety of opinion on what China should do next. You're going to have liberal reformers like Sun Yat-sen. This gentleman here, when you look at him, what do you think? Characteristics. European. Right. He appears very westernized, doesn't he? Western hair, Western mustache, Western coat and tie. He's a Chinese-born man, yes. So, what do you think his take on China's future is? Westernized. Liberal democracy. Let's be like the West. Then you've got the young people. Young people are powerful members of pretty much every revolutionary movement in the 19th and 20th centuries. Yes? Great question. Why is it always young people? Not necessarily because they're easily persuaded, because while I can certainly manipulate you all sometimes, you are also typically very, very critical, and you're suspicious. And you're even cynical to an extent sometimes. You're oftentimes very hard to convince to do much of anything, like read your textbook, study, eat your vegetables, right? Right. But what do young people have the advantage of that adults do not? Do what? All right. Ownership of the future, I think some would say. Stephen? Lack of responsibility. Do most young people have their own family to worry about? No. Do most young people have a home to worry about taking care of and paying for? Are most young people in a position to provide economically or financially for their family's well-being and survival? No. So that freedom, that lack of responsibility, then translates to a lot of free time. Because if you don't have any of those financial obligations, do you have to go to work? No. And you can spend most of your time learning, which is why the young people that we see involved in a lot of these revolutions are students. People who are spending their time filling their brains with new ideas. And then they want to act on those new ideas. Nick?
So young people would be much better soldiers for rebellion.
Why?
Because they're more agile, generally stronger than older people.
And prone to take stupid risks. Yeah, absolutely. Like climbing trees. Paul. All right, then we also have, let's just add to the chaos here. We also then have secret societies. Secret societies here are going to be your social conservatives. This is not like the Illuminati. They are not secretly plotting to take over the world. But they will be very, very fond of traditional Chinese culture, which means things like what? Confucianism, dynasties. They're going to want to maintain those traditions. Then let's throw in another group, because we haven't made this confusing enough yet. All those Western nations that are currently profiting from China's chaos. What's their interest?
Keep it chaotic.
Keep it chaotic. Do England or France or the United States want to see a stable, effective Chinese government? No. They'll lose money. So they're all for chaos. They're all for tradition. The students are all for modern, progressive westernization, along with people like Sun Yat-sen. And then there's Japan. Japan is now in a position, thanks to their industrialization, where they're seriously thinking about being an imperial power, just like other nations in Western Europe. So what do you think Japan's interest is? Right. We want to own China, if possible. And if we can't own all of it, we'll settle for parts of it. So what's their interest in China's government?
Get it out of the way.
Right, get out of the way. We want a weak, unstable Chinese government just like the West.
And where does Chiang Kai-shek fall in this?
Chiang Kai-shek is another Chinese man who is going to be far more in favor of, depending on who you ask and how you look at it, some of the more Western traditions of government. Something that's a little bit more democratic. And he's going to run right up against people like Mao Zedong, who want a far more communist China. So there are all these different factions in play. And before we get to who wins, what do you think the sum of all of these groups does to China? What's that? Makes it more unstable. Lots of dead people. I mean, as soon as one group thinks they're able to gain power, you now suddenly have 4 other groups of people that are diametrically opposed. Who's the one group we left out that you learned about in the reading quiz? The people that actually have power in China. The warlords. People that have their own private armies. So Sun Yat-sen actually takes power for a while. He is democratically elected as a president of China. Guess who doesn't care? The warlords. So Sun Yat-sen and his elected cabinet of officials make all kinds of laws and make all kinds of statements and changes to China. Guess what happens? Nothing. Because Sun Yat-sen and all of his elected people don't have any actual power.
Why didn't they raise their own army as a national Chinese army?
Well, that's what's going to eventually happen with both the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by Mao Zedong. But prior to that point, you kind of have this brief feudal period in China where you have almost different kingdoms, each one ruled by this powerful warlord and his own little private army. And eventually Sun Yat-sen realizes, man, I don't have any power. And he actually steps down. He's like, I quit. And he throws his support. He's like, well, let me at least do something with my office here. So he actually steps down. He says, this guy up north, this warlord guy, I like him the best out of all these other ones, so I think everybody should make him the new emperor. I'm going to give up on all of my plans to bring in a liberal Western government, and let's just get some stability here. We can rally people behind the idea of another dynasty. Let's take this warlord guy up north. Let's make him the new emperor. Come on, people. China, China, China. That doesn't work either. China is so fragmented at that point, so many different opinions and perspectives and desires. It's so hard to rally everyone together. And this is both before, during, and immediately after World War I. Right. Keep spoiling my stories, Nick. You can develop a reputation. All right, so let's talk about what actually happens then, now that we've talked about all the different groups involved. We have something called the May 4th movement. May 4th being the date upon which all of this unrest begins. But you have all these young people and all of these liberal, westernizing, middle-class folks that want to see that kind of change in China. They lead this protest movement, which turns into kind of a quasi-violent uprising. And they try to implement this Western-style democracy. And that's the movement that initially puts Sun Yat-sen into power. And it doesn't work for all the reasons we just talked about. So a little bit later down the road, some of these middle-class philosophers, thinkers, political leaders, they're kind of taking stock of China. They're looking at what they have, and they're looking at what they don't. And what does China have a lot of at this point? People. And what are most of those people doing? They're farming. So what's their social status? Peasant. What's their economic status? Poor. Right. And some don't even have that. And so some of these thinkers are looking around going, you know, that's the problem we have to solve. we have this massive population. We need to get them on board. What is going to get a massive population of poor peasants excited about government? Food and money, and the prospect of actually having some of both, food and money. And that's where you see the rise of the Communist Party. Initially led by this guy Li Dazhao, and then later Mao Zedong.
Did Mao kill Li Dazhao?
I don't think he killed him, but I'm not sure. And they're going to take confidence and get some hope out of the Russian Communist Revolution that has just taken place. And because it's just taken place, what has there not been time for yet? New ideas. And what has there not been time for yet in Russia?
A chance to see if it's going to succeed, if the policies are going to succeed or fail.
Right, a chance to see if it works. Right now, all we have is the excitement. Right now, all we have is the idea that, oh wow, look at that. All of those people rose up together under this idea of communism where everybody's going to be socially and economically equal. How great is that? And look, they won. Nobody's had the chance to look 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years down the road and go, wow, that was a bad idea. So the Communist Party begins to get very, very popular in China. At the same time, there is a second group of people, the nationalists, the Kuomintang Party, which are still very much in favor of this Western-style government, kind of. And in both of these cases, you're going to see some elements of this warlord mentality creep in, with both the communists and with the nationalists. You're going to see elements of this warlord mentality creep in, which means what? What do we mean by this warlord mentality? How do you gain power and get people on your side? Right, conquering them, force, military force. There's a fairly graphic picture in your textbook of a member of the Kuomintang Party and a guy on the ground and a gun. So this is not a peaceful, non-violent, ideological movement. This is very much in some ways a civil war. And so you have a variety of figures involved. The most important ones, the ones that you need to retain far longer than the others, Mao Zedong, who's in charge of which party? The Communists. And Chiang Kai-shek, who's in charge of which party? The Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party. What eventually happens is the Communists win and the Nationalists lose. Right. What eventually happens is the Communists win, the Nationalists lose. The Nationalists will eventually be exiled to Taiwan. And the Communist Party, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, will finally, after World War II, establish the most stable government that China has had since its last dynasty. So that's kind of the entire story, getting a little bit ahead of where we are now. Yes, Nick?
Now, what would have happened if Chiang Kai-shek had defeated Mao Zedong and if Kuomintang had remained in power in China?
Who knows? I mean, it would depend on whether or not the peasantry was on board with him, whether he could have promised them enough to keep them happy now that the promise of communism would be gone. It would depend on how much foreign interest continued in China, especially given the Western nations that were supporting Chiang Kai-shek, whether they would have helped China develop or just gone right back to extracting whatever they could of value from China for themselves. There's a lot of maybes and possiblies in that scenario. So I'm not sure. Now, what we do know, though, as far as China goes, is that while this does bring about some stability, it also brings about a pretty significant change, much like we saw with Russia when they had their communist revolution. They go from having a questionably effective, but at least stable form of government with the czars, to now this brand new form of government that nobody has any familiarity with, most people don't understand, people are excited about, but they have no idea what this will look like in the future. China now has this same scenario. They've had millennia of dynasties, ruled by emperors, claiming the mandate of heaven. And what they have now is something brand new, foreign, and unknown. And so China, from this point forward, is going to look very, very different from the China that you have come to know throughout these last 4,000 years of history. We're not going to have an emperor. We're not going to have a civil service exam. Confucianism will no longer be the bedrock of China's philosophy and social order. It's going to be a very, very different China. And that's one of the things that makes this chapter relatively confusing for people to read, is it doesn't look like China anymore. Yes, Nick?
What is Chiang Kai-shek's religion? Do we know?
I have no idea. And professed public faith versus what people actually believe, that's one of the weaknesses of history, is typically the only things that get recorded are the things that are stated publicly. So, who knows? Now, again, because you guys typically skip over maps in your textbook, let me show you what the one in your textbook shows you. The pink is the area controlled by the Kuomintang, which are who? The nationalists, and who's their leader? Chiang Kai-shek. The orange is the warlords. The red is the areas that Japan controls. So again, maybe this helps you visually see just how divided China is. And then as we come over here, you see the rising spread of the influence of the communists, starting in northern China and gradually expanding their way all the way down until eventually Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party is evicted from China and they move over to the island of Taiwan, where they reside to this day, and it's still a point of contention between the two areas. According to China, Taiwan doesn't exist. Does anybody know what it's called?
No, I know.
It's called Chinese Taipei. They refuse to acknowledge its independence, and they basically look at it as a colony, a protectorate, or whatever you want to call it, of China itself. Taiwan maintains its total sovereign independence, and they want to be recognized by the United Nations as such, as an independent national entity. And so this is a constant state of conflict and potential conflict between these two nations. It's always interesting, actually, to see when the Olympics come around, how Taiwan is introduced. Whether they're introduced as the island of Taiwan, or whether they're introduced as Chinese Taipei. Stephen? I believe the UN recognizes Taiwan, which I think is another thing that upsets China. Paul? Chinese Taipei. Right. Nick?
Now, I had heard that in the very beginning of the UN, so about the 50s, we, as the head of the UN, recognized China, the nationalists in Taiwan, as the legitimate Chinese government.
Yes.
And so they got the first thing on the Security Council.
Right. All right, so that does it for 29. I hope that clears up some confusion about China. Next class, we're taking a look at Chapter 30, which is the Great Depression. I know you got some background to that in middle school, so hopefully this will just be adding on. And then please remember that next week, Tuesday, you have your quiz on 28, 29, and 30.